Is elm any good for beneficial insects, especially pollinators like honeybees? I'm Rob from Dowdle Family Farms, and one of my mentors in the beekeeping industry has talked about how elms are good for honeybees. But when you Google elms and how good they are for honeybees, there's a lot of different opinions online about that. In fact, a lot of researchers aren't real convinced either way. This little tree that I'm standing under right here is a winged elm. It's the only type of elm that I was familiar with, and you can tell because it has those little wings on the tips of some of the smaller branches. So I checked this tree in 2021 and 2022 to see if it was blooming, and it did not bloom. So I came to set up this introduction to this video under this elm, and I'll be, if it's not blooming for the first time that I've ever noticed. Now, there are a bunch of different types of elm. This is a winged elm. We've got what I call American elm on the farm as well. And you may be more familiar with some of the more ornamental elms like Drake elm. I happened to be driving down the road right where my honeybee hives were located, and I happened to see just the faintest bit of reddish, brownish, greenish, I wasn't sure what color it was, growing on the trees. I've got a picture of that I'll throw up right now. But that right there turned out to be elm. So it turns out where I've had my honeybees for the longest period of time, I have over 20 elms within a 500-yard radius. It blew my mind. This tree right here is what I consider to be American elm. It may be a different type of elm. You can see that it's just now starting to bloom. I'll try to get a close-up picture of that. A week ago, these were still buds, and they weren't even starting to bloom yet, although the tops of the trees were blooming. It's 65 degrees or so out here today, and I don't see honeybees on this right now. Most of the time, if we have much red maple blooming, the honeybees are on the red maple rather than the elm. But I have seen honeybees working this, especially as the red maple begins to fade out. My suspicion is that they're getting more pollen than they are nectar from this elm, but I may be wrong in that. All I know is I see them working the elm. There is some debate among the beekeeping community about whether honeybees actually work with elm, but in my experience, they do. Though not as much as they do with the red maples, because we have a lot of red maple around as well. Now, a couple things that you'll find about elm is that they have small blooms, typically on very tall trees. This tree just happens to be overhanging the pasture, and I can actually see the blooms on it. Most of our elms and all of our red maples that I'm aware of are growing in the middle of woods, and so the blooms are up 40, 50, 60 feet high, maybe even 80 feet high. Whereas this one just happens to be on the edge of the woods, and we can see it, and I can actually see that there are honeybees on it from time to time. Again, I think it's going to be a few days still before, there was a honeybee right there, but I think it's going to be a few days before we see many honeybees on this. But they do prefer the red maple over the elm, but it is good for the same reasons red maple is that it is a good pollen source at a time of the year when they don't always have a whole lot of pollen available. You can see in this picture, you may be able to see that the elm is blooming some, but in this patch of woods, there are 14 or 15 different elms that I'm aware of. If you turn behind me into the pig pen back there, there are some huge elms back here. So this patch of woods is at a lower elevation than the rest of the pasture. It's probably about 5 feet below. You can see that the ground here dips from the pasture above. The reason I mention that is because this tree right here in front of me, the big, big tree, and if you look up, you can actually see the red on it. That's an elm. I'm assuming it's an American elm, but it has a lot of flowers on it if you're looking for it. But I'd be willing to bet that of the people that drive on that road right there, several of them don't even notice that it's blooming. So in this little acre of woods, you've got this huge elm tree here, but you've also got several other smaller elms, probably 10 or 12 of them as well. So this thing is probably a good 24 to 26, maybe 28 inches in diameter. Just a huge, huge tree. I don't hear people mention elm as much as they do red maples, but I just talked to a friend in Irwin County, Georgia, who used to keep bees, and she said that she's got some Drake elms in her yard, and particularly one on her back patio that she said when it starts blooming, it's not blooming yet, and it's February 19th. However, when it starts blooming, she says that the honeybees just swarm all over that Drake elm. And she doesn't have any honeybee colonies anymore, so they're coming in from somewhere in the neighboring area. So it's obvious that honeybees do work elm, and sometimes some elm anyway, like that Drake elm, they just swarm all over. In fact, she even said they can hear it, the bees buzzing from inside their home, and it's outside their back patio. So they're apparently working something on the Drake elm. Another thing that Glenda Jo, my friend in Georgia, mentioned, she said that in August, the honeybees swarm all over the Drake elm as well. And I specifically asked her because I just read this American Bee Journal article in the February 2017 issue. So the author of the article was saying that the bees were most likely making honeydew, honey from elm. Well, what Glenda Jo was saying just confirmed that, because in August, I mean, it is just a summer dearth. But in South Georgia and in Mississippi, there's not much blooming that time of the year. Honeydew is a secretion from insects like aphids that will attack trees. They stick their mouth parts into the trees and are trying to get that milky sap. The aphids need the amino acids and the proteins from the sap, but sap, because it has more water and then more sugar in it than the amino acids that they need, they secrete a lot of the sugars from the sap. So what honeybees do when there's a dearth, like there is in August in South Georgia and like there is in Mississippi in August, honeybees will actually take those excretions, that honeydew, and make honey out of it. If you're interested in more information, just do a Google search of honeydew honey, or forest honey it's also called. I hope to do an updated video this fall about honeybees and honeydew honey, but that is kind of an interesting thing, and she's the only person I know who has actually confirmed what I read in that article. But again, I haven't asked a whole lot of people about it. So what's so good about elm? Do honeybees get a lot of nectar and pollen from elm? They get something from elm. I don't know that it's a whole lot. In my experience, they prefer red maple over elm. However, once the red maple begins to fade, they will work the elm. I don't know whether they're getting just the pollen or the pollen and the nectar. I think they primarily get pollen, but either way, the bees will work it, and it is a good source for honeybees after the red maple starts to dry up in our area. Have you seen honeybees working elm? Are you familiar with honeybees making honey out of honeydew? Let me know in the comments if you would, and also let me know what geographical area of the world you're in. I'd really like to know this information to help pass it on. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel. Take care, have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.